Hi everyone, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos for ChessLecture.com, and in this show and the next one I'd like to show a couple of really nice games illustrating the theme of Blockade. And it would be hard to do any better to illustrate this theme than with a game from the great Tigran Petrosian, not the current Armenian Grandmaster who's still alive, but the former world chess champion, the 9th world champion if I'm remembering correctly. Great player, famed for his ability to just snuff the life out of the opponent's possibilities. Now, sometimes he would go a little too far in this respect and would draw a fairly high number of games, but the guy was almost impossible to beat, and part of his genius for that was, again, just his ability to smell what the guy was up to from miles and miles away and kill it even before the other guy even could think of a plan. So we'll see that in this game. This is from the Stockholm Interzonal in 1962. When Petrosian was on his way up, he got through this event without a loss. I believe he took or tied for second behind Fischer. And then he won the Candidates Tournament, this massive 27-round event. Should have been 28, but Tal dropped out in the 4th cycle, so he missed a game. So it was a 27-game event. And he went through this monster event undefeated. And then finally he beat Botvinnik to win the title, which he held for 6 years. So, as I said, this was him on his way up, and his opponent here is Samuel Schweber, an Argentinian IM. Let's see what happens. So Petrosian had white, and it's a King's Indian, an opening which Petrosian had great success throughout his career against. Certainly, like anyone else, he lost some games to it on occasion, but by and large, he was enormously successful. Part of his success can be attributed to a system that he himself devised with knight f3, castles, and then the bishop coming to g5, and then the pawn often coming to d5. So he played this system that's now named after him. But in this game, he chose the Averbakh system, which similarly is based on attempting to restrain black's forces. Now, here the main moves are c5 and knight to a6. And the idea of knight a6 is to prepare e5. So those of you who are King's Indian fans, probably most of you know, maybe all of you know, but you certainly should all know, that e5, which is a perfectly good move against many white systems, like knight f3 here. So a knight f3, e5 is by far the most common move. But after bishop to g5, you can't do this because white trades, and trades again, and can even trade a third time, and then plays knight to d5. And this wins a pawn here, because threatening this. Black can survive the worst with knight b to d7, but still that's not good for black. Also, white can do it the other way around. This isn't bad either. Knight to d5 straight away. So this is not to be done if you're black. But knight to a6 is the way of preparing that. So now on e5 and all those captures, the a6 knight defends the pawn on c7, so knight to d5 won't be a double attack. It'll just attack the bishop, which can safely run away. So, as I said, c5 is a way to go, knight a6 is a way to go. In the game, Schweber played h6. Now bishop to e3, and even here c5 can be played. This is a perfectly legitimate move, this pawn sack, but he played e5 instead, so that's another benefit of h6. On the other hand, white can gain a tempo back, sometimes with queen to d2. All right, Petrosian played d5, keeping the center closed, c6, and now Petrosian finds a really fascinating way of trying to take advantage of this h6 plan. So he plays h4, and the idea of this is not to create any kind of attack. He's not going to attempt to checkmate black on the king side. Well, at least not for the next 40 or 50 moves. But what he is doing, well, you'll see it in a moment. So Schweber traded and played knight b to d7, and now h5. Black could have prevented this, of course, with h5 himself, but then two things. So first of all, he's weakening the g5 square and the dark squares in general. And also remember, black very often in many King's Indians with the locked center wants to go for f5. But now f5 is really difficult to achieve. I mean, especially if black or white plays h5. So if the black pawn is on h5, then f5 is just creating further weaknesses, and especially you can see a knight jumping into a square like e6. On the other hand, in the game, after knight b to d7, h5, okay, black plays g5. If he doesn't do that, then white can either trade, and then there's no f-pawn to go to f5, or white can simply wait, and if black ever plays f5, then h takes g6. So black plays g5, but now f5 is well, first of all, not threatening in the least, but secondly, he's not even going to get to play it. White played f3, and now g4, and black's kingside play is over before it even started. That's what I mean about Petrosian. You know, black wants to play f5, okay, we'll kill it. And just by virtue of black's having played h6 earlier, white had this nasty prophylactic plan to prevent black from playing f5. Now, white isn't going to make any progress on the king side either, except for one thing. Let's compare the f5 and f4 squares. White could conceivably get a knight on f5. I mean, it's not hard to see how that would happen. The knight would come to e2, and then to g3 and f5. And in case we don't want to allow it to be swapped off for this guy, we could bring a second knight to e3. So it's very possible for white to fight for the f5 square. All right, let me get rid of all the circles here. What about the f4 square for black? Well, it looks like it could be occupied, but how exactly does black's knight get there? Let's look at all the squares that it could get to f4 from. e6, oops, covered by a white pawn. g6, same thing. h5, all right, in addition to the fact that it's well defended, okay, there's also the g-pawn. d5, the e-pawn's got it covered. And all the other four squares are on white side of the board, so it's pretty hard to see how white's going to maneuver a knight to f4 via d3, h3, e2, or g2. So in short, the kingside situation is entirely favorable to white. It may not be so much by itself, but it's something, and black has nothing on the kingside, even though it's officially supposed to be his in a king's Indian with a locked center. All right, so what does black do instead? Well, he goes over to the queen side. He plays b5. And one of the things I've noticed over the years studying Petrosian's games is that when he pushes a pawn, he gains space. When his opponent pushes a pawn, he creates weaknesses. And this happens with a disturbing regularity, at least disturbing if you're one of Petrosian's opponents. All right, so b5, it looks like a nice space gainer. Black would like to follow up with maybe knight to b6, perhaps put the bishop on d7 or b7, put the rook on c8, and at some point drop a knight on c4. All right, it looks reasonable. It's a plan, but it's never going to happen. What Petrosian does now is he plays a4. So just as he's blockaded the king side, and to his advantage, now he's going to fix the queen side structure as well. Well, what can black do? I mean, the pawn is attacked 3 times. If he plays b takes a4, white recaptures, and there's going to be pressure against the a6 pawn. So Schweber goes forward, he goes to b4. But now, the c4 square is only going to belong to white, not to black. So Petrosian immediately begins the rerouting of the knight. Also, he may be threatening a5 here to fix this pawn on a6, and in some cases to give himself an outpost on b6. The knight's covering it right now, but maybe, you know, if the knight moves, it could go there. And there's also the idea of knight d2, c4, and then b6. So for that reason, Schweber plays a5, and Petrosian plays knight to d2. So the position is looking very, very good for white. Remarkably, the computer actually likes black's position, or it did after b5. But every move, you know, as you go further in, the computer quickly changes its mind and realizes that black just has a lousy position here. What can black do? Anywhere. Black's bishop on g7 is a horrible piece. I mean, this guy is just basically done for the game. I mean, unless, you know, he can find the time and the opportunity to play that, the bishop is dead. The light squared bishop is not very good, but trading it is even worse, because if he trades it, then the f5 square becomes permanent possession for white. What about the knights? Well, they're okay, but you know, they have to find their way to good squares. And white is also going to get to the c file first. The a5 pawn is slightly weak. You can see a knight on c4 would attack it. The pawn on d6 is likewise slightly weak. It can be attacked by a knight on c4, a knight on b5, a knight on f5. So it's only move 16, and black is already pretty darn close to strategically lost. He's certainly in trouble here. Well, it gets worse. So he plays knight to c5, which looks pretty sensible. Puts the knight on a good square. Maybe he'll play knight f to d7 next. Maybe, well, he really can't consider bishop to a6. But maybe after knight f to d7, he can play rook e8 and start this process of trying to swing this guy around here. But the blockade strategy for white comes through again. So first, Petrosian blockaded the kingside structure. He's blockaded the queenside structure. And now the plan of blockade continues further. Plays bishop takes c5. Very good move. Of course, it's a locked up position, so the knights are going to be better than the bishops anyway. I mean, what's white's bishop doing? So he gets rid of this. Now he's got a protected passed pawn, and he can still seal this queenside structure. He just puts a piece on c4, and these guys are all completely immobile. But first, okay, he doesn't play knight to c4 right away, because if he does that, then black plays bishop a6. Yeah, because if knight e5, I think knight takes e4 should be all right, even if it's a pawn sack. Even if knight takes f7 is good. Well, okay, that won't even be a pawn sack anyway. So this, and then there's bishop b2 with the hideous threat of bishop to c3, winning everything. So white certainly can't do something like that. And let's say he doesn't do that. Let's say he makes some other random move. Well, black is going to take the knight, so he'll get rid of one of the pieces that can come here to f5, and then play knight e8 and then knight to d6 with his own blockade. So the knight will be very well placed on d6, and he'll be ready to take a white knight on f5 should it ever get there. So Petrosian finds a much better move than knight to c4. Plays bishop to b5. So he's going to shield this knight. He wants to have a knight on c4. That's more important. The light squared bishop, it looks nice, but it doesn't really have so much that it can do. It's more a piece that can restrict black's forces, but it doesn't have too much by way of its own positive prospects. So here, Schweber plays bishop to b7, knight e2, knight e8, and now Schweber wants to play knight to d6. So again, get this nice blockading knight there, be able to fight for the f5 square a bit. It all makes sense, but bishop takes e8. So no knights for you, Mr. Schweber. They're all gone. Rook e8, knight c4, and here black is positionally lost, no question. He can trade his bishop for one knight or the other, but not both. So white is going to end up with a knight on f5 if he wants, or a knight on c4, maybe both, depending on what black does. The bishop on g7 now has no hopes. I mean, that plan that I mentioned before of kind of wiggling it around to b6, well, now it does nothing. b6 is just as dead as g7. There's nothing for this bishop unless you can sort of bug house it to d4, but there's no way for it to get there by legal moves. Black's rooks, what are they going to do? They have no files at all. There's no way to pry open anything. I mean, the only way he could conceivably open a file is by playing f5 and then and then pushing g4 or e4, whichever way white would allow. But that doesn't look good at all. It's just that would be the only way you could even conceivably get a rook into the game. So black just has nothing. Move 21, he's strategically dead lost. All right. He played bishop to a6. Petrosian plays queen to b3. He wants to keep f5 free or he wants to have the other knight going to f5. Queen f6. And here Petrosian could have maybe saved a little time with king to f2. Would have been the most economical way of dealing with the threat of bishop takes c4 followed by queen f3. And to cover up squares like e3, f3, and g3. But it doesn't really matter much. He plays rook to c1, and if black wants to take, he'll play rook c4 and immediately start to put some pressure against the pawn on c5. So bishop to f8 was played, both with an eye to helping blockade white's d-pawn and also protecting the pawn on c5. White plays knight to g3. We know where he's going. Now here, if black tries to break through to get a little play with queen f4, okay, hitting the rook, white plays king f2, and now let's say black gets excited about life and goes for a check. Well, the problem with this neat idea is that after knight e2, the queen has absolutely nowhere to go, and the next move is rook to d1. So the queen's lost. So even the one seeming opportunity for counterplay available to black really isn't. All right, well, he can't abide a knight on f5, so he plays bishop back to c8. White castles. Rook to d8. Again, trying to blockade. King to g2, protecting the f3 pawn and the knight on g3. So it's neutralizing queen f4 in advance. Again, very typical of Petrosian. Before the opponent can ever actually make a threat, you defend against that threat. Rook a7, rook f2, king h7. Very meaningful move there. Just kidding. Rook f to c2. And all right, at this point, White still has to win the game, but Black is very tied down. He's tied down to the weak A5 pawn, the E5 pawn, the C5 pawn. These are all weak. He has to keep an eye on the F5 square. There's this passed D pawn. But still, it's going to take some work to actually break Black down. So what should he do? Maybe he puts a knight on F5. Maybe he puts pressure on the C pawn by putting a knight to C3. On D3. So there are a number of ways that he can try to make progress, but it still has to be done. But in the game, Schweber just made a blunder. So he just dropped the pawn here with Queen A6. And after knight takes E5, now it's now the game kind of wins itself. But still, Petrosian's technique from here is very nice. Still, even before this, I mean, it's a really remarkable positional achievement to have Black have such an absolutely pitiful position. You know, there were no sort of brilliancies involved. There were no sacrifices, no fantastic novelties. Just this very clever plan of blockading. And you can see White has everything. Good knights against bad bishops, better structure. Black has weaknesses. So sooner or later, White would have won this position. But again, Queen A6 makes it simpler. So knight takes E5, rook C7, and we just go back. Knight C4, bishop G7, and Queen to D3, threatening E5 with check. King G8, rook to D2, rook E7, and here Petrosian makes a nice liquidation or a nice exchanging combination. So he plays E5. Now, this is not really a pawn that Black can afford to allow to live. I mean, if it stays on the board, then White's just going to keep going forward with D6 at some point. Knight goes to F5, and White will just smash through the center. So Black takes, White takes, rook takes, Queen takes, and then rook C5. So White regained his extra pawn and is threatening to take on A5 and is threatening knight F5. So all of this is rather too much for Black to handle here. Plays bishop C8, so again stopping knight F5, but now White's up 2 pawns. Life is good. F5, and Petrosian's happy to just exchange off a couple more units here. 2 pawns up is enough. And rook to B5. And here, if White trades the B pawn for the D pawn and swaps off a pair of rooks, the 2 connected passed pawns on the queen side will win very, very easily. So Schweber goes for a little counterplay, or at least he hopes for a little counterplay with rook to F8. But now, nice little tactical trick, D6. And the point is that on rook takes F3, D7 wins the rook, because the threat's D8 queen, and Black has no defense to that doesn't hang the rook on F3. So Black cannot take on F3, and chose instead to swap rooks and play King F7, D7, and here Schweber resigned. The reason is that after King E7, B6, threatening B7, and then queening one upon the other. So let's say rook to B8, King G3, King D8. White plays rook to D6. And what is Black going to do? If he just goes back and forth with his rook, then White comes in, takes this guy, takes that guy, and promotes the H-pawn. If he tries for something vaguely resembling counterplay, well, now White can just queen, just liquidate, and the king and pawn ending is a win by many tempi. So this is not even close. So for that reason, Schweber resigned in this position, completely hopeless and helpless. So fantastic game by Petrosian, a great illustration of what a blockade is in an aggressive sense, right? I mean, this wasn't Petrosian trying to blockade to hold the position like the famous game against Reshevsky from the 1953 candidates. Rather, this was an aggressive blockade. I mean, he was trying to constrict Black, create weaknesses, and then pick at these weaknesses later and just win a little bit at a time. And, sure enough, I mean, Black finally cracked. I think he would have won anyway in the long run without too much difficulty, but still, just the pressure of having so many problems on the board just overloaded Schweber. So here we see a beautiful example of an aggressive kind of blockading strategy. So it's not just to defend, it's not just to save a game by creating some kind of fortress. It can be very much an attacking method as well. So I hope you enjoyed this game, and I would certainly, if you like this game, I would wholeheartedly recommend getting a book of Petrosian's games and going through them. I mean, he's a unique player in chess history, one who won many really fascinating games like this, and I think his style is quite instructive as well. Check that out, and I will see you next time. This is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos signing off for ChessLecture.com. Bye-bye.